People always talk about how the 710 is almost impossible, but what's the best strategy to make it? To answer this, I found over 100 710 conversions online and did a rigorous study of each of them. After analyzing these 104 attempts, I found the 3 most important factors for making this spare. So first, which pin should you aim for? According to successful spare attempts, 60% of bowlers aim for the 10 pin, while only 40% aim for the 7 pin. Does this mean the 10 pin is the better pin to hit? Well, I don't think so. The 10 pin is the most common spare for right-handed bowlers, so it also happens to be the most practiced spare. If most bowlers had to choose one pin to hit, it would probably be a 10 pin. So I don't think this chart means too much. To support this, take a look at this chart. For this one, I also took into consideration if bowlers use their right or left hand. If they use their left hand, since their 7 pin is equivalent to a righty's 10 pin, I counted it as a 10 pin. And as you can see, 75% of bowlers are hitting the pin on the same side as their dominant hand. Probably nothing to do with strategy, but most bowlers seem to prefer that pin. This also got me thinking who makes more of these spares, righties or lefties? Since out of the people who made this spare on TV, 3 of the 4 of them are lefties. So is being a lefty an advantage? Well, probably not. Looking at the larger sample size, only 12% of conversions were made by lefties. Considering 10 to 12% of people are lefties, this chart makes sense. So what actually matters when going for the 710? This chart is probably the most important. But first, let's understand the bowling lane. Instead of thinking about hitting the 7 or the 10 pin, think about hitting the pin by the ball return or the pin opposite of it. In a pair of lanes, these pins are by the ball return and these are by the wall. So it depends which lane you are on, the left or the right. People have speculated that it's easier to hit the pin on the side opposite of the ball return since there is something to bounce the pin off of, whereas the ball return makes it harder for the pins to bounce off. From my study, this might be the case. 65% of 710s made were from hitting the pin on this side of the lane, while only 35% of them were hitting the pin by the ball return. Even though most people default to the 10 pin, the pin you should actually try to hit is the one by the wall, opposite of the ball return. Okay, but where do you hit the pin? There's 3 parts I defined. First, you can hit the outside to chop the pin across. You can also hit the pin head on to hope for a double bounce and get the pin to go over. Or you can hit the inside, so it bounces off the wall and into the other pin. From my study, the best strategy seems to be just hitting the middle, which was almost half of all makes. So why is this the case? Well, most people aim for the spare head on when hitting the corner pins normally. That way you get some miss room left and right. Hitting the pin on the side is riskier, as a miss means you would get 0. This is all true, but you shouldn't just hit the middle because it's safer. It's also more reliable to get the pin to bounce over. To show this, let's take a look at what kind of pin action gets people to hit the other pin. There's 5 types of pin actions I define. First is the pin hitting the same wall. Then there's the pin double bouncing on the ball. The pin can also hit the other wall. The pin can also bounce off the back. Finally, the pin can also roll across the deck. So what's the most common way this spare is being picked up? There's so many different ways to pick it up, but at 18% it's double bouncing it on the ball, hitting it the back, and rolling over. The second most common way is hitting the same wall and rolling over at 15%. But third is once again double bouncing and hitting the back and straight into the pin. Double bouncing off the ball seems to be one of the most reliable strategies here. This chart shows what the pin has to do to convert this spare. 50% of spares are double bounce off the ball, whereas less than 40% of them hit the same wall and bounce off there. Another key factor is that the pin almost always needs to hit off the back and roll to hit the other pin. Double bouncing it seems to be the best way of doing this. So, hit the pin head on and pick the pin opposite of the ball return. But what angle do you hit the pin at? A big angle or straight up? As it turns out, 70% of these spares are hit at a big angle, and less than 4% are hit going really straight. This makes sense, as the way most people hit corner pins is by going at a big angle. There wasn't much correlation I could find between bigger angle and better bounce, so the angle doesn't seem to matter too much. Going at a bigger angle is probably still best because it gives you the most miss room. But something that definitely matters is speed. Obviously, you have to throw it fast, but how fast? Looking at this chart, the average speed I recorded for these conversions is about 20 miles an hour. That's pretty quick. It doesn't mean you can't make it if you throw it a bit slower. The slowest ball that made it was 14.8 miles an hour. But below that, your chances are probably extremely low. Speed's definitely a huge factor, so if it takes using a lighter ball, it might be worth it. There were a couple conversions with someone using a lighter ball to get to that speed. But does higher ball speed mean better bounce? Maybe. Here's a chart showing the bounce duration for each conversion, or how long it takes for one pin to hit the other. Most of the time, it takes around 0.7 seconds to find out if you made the spare or not. The fastest is 0.29 seconds, but the slowest one is 3.12 seconds. But how correlated is ball speed to how long it takes for the pin to get there. There's some correlation, but it's not the highest. But usually as the ball speed goes up, bounce duration does go down. The fastest shot by Osku, of course, had the quickest bounce over. However, there were a lot of shots around 21 miles an hour that took a while to get there. Speed is important, but sacrificing accuracy for a bit of speed doesn't seem to make you that much more likely to make it. So throw the ball fast, but not too fast where you can't control it. Speaking of speed, one-handers tend to throw it faster than two-handers. To prove that, here's the average speed of both. Quite a big difference. But does that give them a higher chance of making the spare? This is likely true. Even with the two-hand revolution and a lot of professionals switching to this technique, they only make up 8% of 710s made. For this spare, speed is needed, so one hand is probably better than two. But what if you can't throw it one-handed? What's the best strategy for two-handed bowlers? Interestingly, you go for the 7-pin. Every single time. It's a small sample size, but out of the two-handed bowlers, the majority of the makes were at the 7-pin. Is this because two-handed bowlers prefer the 7 over the 10? Not necessarily. Every time Jason Belmonte hit it, he also went for the 7-pin. Maybe it's something to do with the high revolution spinning into the 7-pin, but this seems to be the best pin for two-handers to hit. Speaking of spin, does that help or hurt your chances of making the spare? Looking at these graphs, straight balls tend to be faster and result in more convincing conversions, with less bounce duration. However, the majority of 710s are actually made with rotation, so it's not a huge deal. Some were even made with a backup ball. But should your ball be spinning towards the pin, like a 7-pin, or away from it, like a 10-pin? This chart suggests that if you don't go straight, you should hook away from the pin. But there's likely some bias here due to everyone hitting their 10-pins this way. But what I have found is that if you hook towards the pin, it seems to have a very slightly higher chance of hitting the same wall harder and at a better angle to bounce across, which is why for two-handers, it might be better to hit the 7-pin. If you take into account the rotation and the angle you throw the ball at, here's all the distributions, but I wasn't able to find that much correlation here. Lastly, the pin headers are obviously pretty important, as different ones give more or less pin bounce. I couldn't get any stats on these unfortunately, but this spare is obviously going to be easier to pick up in some centers rather than others. So, how do you make this spare? First, aim for the pin opposite of the ball return. If you're a two-hander, maybe just go for the 7-pin if you're more comfortable with that. Then, aim for the pin head on. Aim for the edge is harder and doesn't really help your chances. The angle doesn't really matter, but do what you normally do, which is going at a big angle for most people. To make this spare, you would have to throw it pretty fast. 20 miles an hour is an average, but don't sacrifice accuracy for a bit of ball speed, as it's generally not worth it. Using a lighter ball is fine. As for spin, you'll probably get faster speed without it, but spin itself shouldn't hurt. In fact, it might even help the ball hit the wall harder if you spin towards the pin. But that's pretty much it. If you made this spare before, tell us your experience and your tips for picking this up. This video took a while to make, so I hope you enjoyed it.